Reform of the Bretton Woods institutions has been talked about for a very long time, and I think that arguably for organisations like the IMF, the current crisis could prove a lifesaver, because before this there are a lot of people saying that the IMF was simply sliding into irrelevance. Fewer countries were borrowing from it, and many more countries have actually got their own reserves. And so the question being asked was what role for the IMF in the future? Then along came the crisis, and particularly in the lead-up to the G20 Leaders Forums in both Washington last year and then in April in London this year, there was a lot of discussion and some very vigorous debate about the potential for Bretton Woods too. The proponents argued pretty clearly that if ever there was cast-iron proof that the current structure didn't work, then this crisis was it. And if there was ever a crisis not to waste, then this crisis was it too. So we all talked about it, and certainly we did on Late Line Business, about redrawing the IMF, giving greater membership to the developing economies, and giving a bigger say to those smaller countries and creating global financial regulations. Then the leaders' summits came and went, and in the end we ended up with something quite significantly different or less than a new framework. Some argue that we really hardly changed the old framework at all. And I think, as has been written since, it was probably silly to expect otherwise. The Economist magazine put it very well. A 5-hour powwow of global leaders was never going to be a sequel to the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. It lasted 3 weeks and followed 2 years of technical preparation. What we did get, though, from the G20 leaders' meetings was a declaration that committed the countries to reform the Bretton Woods institutions so that they can more adequately reflect changing economic weights. And the IMF was certainly promised a lot more money, an extra $500 billion, and in the eyes of some, a new sense of purpose. So arguably the process of reform has begun. The question is, what's the end game? I thought that was a good place to start this morning's discussion. With the global institutions, particularly the IMF that was designed all those years ago, where to from here? Do we start again, or do we renovate what we've got? Tim Harcourt?
Well, Ali, it's important that you raise Bretton Woods, because in many ways I think John Maynard Keynes says ideas is what runs the world. And if you read the 3 Skidelsky volumes of Keynes's life, it was Fighting for Britain, the 3rd volume, where he basically literally killed himself negotiating Bretton Woods, which is probably the most fascinating, because he basically took economic ideas and built a global architecture for the world. But, it was a long time ago, and it was a transatlantic tussle between the US and Britain. Therefore, the world as it was then is very different now, with the emerging, with the different China and India and Brazil, the economies we have to deal with now. So I think the issues are different. The global balances in the world economy are very different. And in many ways, I think it's almost the true the true test of economic policy is how you can put together some practical institutions to govern the world, or certainly help the global environment.
Robert Lawrence, can I bring you in here? From what Tim just said, does that very much mean that we're looking rather more at renovating than starting again, because whatever is wrong with the current institutions, simply to start again may prove simply impossible?
I agree with that. The players are there, their interests aren't yet fully reflected, but we don't need to start from tabula rasa. We have accumulated a lot of experience. And in fact, we are already seeing very, very significant changes in the way the IMF is behaving. And it may be more important to change behavior than to change architecture. And so if you look at what the IMF has been doing in this crisis, it is just remarkably different from their stance, from the stances that they adopted during the Asian financial crisis. They're boasting about it too, by the way, if you listen to what the IMF is saying. Firstly, they have more resources, and the G20 has even given them more. But they're giving them out more easily. We're not seeing massive structural adjustment preconditions imposed on countries before they get the money. The IMF, particularly countries, Colombia, Mexico, who have reasonably good economic policies, but have simply found themselves in difficulties because of the crisis, are being given access to financial resources without a lot of preconditions and on easy terms. So I think the IMF itself is changing. It did confess, mea culpa, that they had failed to anticipate the regulatory weaknesses in the global economy. Their analytical work is also extremely good at the moment, and they're not pulling punches. They came out with this number that in the United States the losses could be up to $3 trillion. So I would say we've already started to see the seeds of changes in behavior. The major issues, I think, are representational ones.
Which I'd like to ask you about in a minute, but Peter Hutch, if I can bring you in here.
Well, Ali, you know, the question about do you reform it or do you start again, it's a bit like the Australian Federation. If you were designing a national government system for Australia from scratch, you wouldn't recreate federation. It's seriously dysfunctional where the states and the federal government are in a perpetual tug of war. You've got local government as well. You've got 3 tiers. It's dysfunctional, and you wouldn't start afresh with that model. But it's what we're stuck with. The international architecture is very similar. It's dysfunctional, but it's what we're stuck with. So you have to try and fix it rather than, unfortunately, we can't start again. We just heard Bob's point that behaviour may be more important than structure. I think unless you get both, I think it's a failure. First of all, as Bob just said, the IMF has acknowledged that its anticipatory work was inadequate. In other words, this giant crisis was looming and bearing down upon us, and the IMF stood there like a rabbit in the spotlight, said nothing, did nothing. It's not because it wasn't possible to predict what was going on. If you look at for example, the central bank, as it's often called, the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS foresaw the crisis, warned of the crisis, well ahead of the crisis, while the IMF was standing there mute. So, huge failure of analysis, huge failure of prudential work, huge failure of forecasting. And then, of course, there's the structure as well. And, there's a lot to talk about there, but I think unless you fix both of those elements, we have failed, and it's a wasted opportunity.
Tim, I can see that you want to speak here, but I just want to, and I'll put this question to you. Failure of recognition in the lead up to the crisis is one thing, but is this not, or doesn't this go to the very heart of one of the problems with the IMF, which is the way the rich countries view it? I mean, the IMF is to a certain extent beholden to the information that is imparted to it. And I can't imagine if the IMF had stood up 2 years ago and said to America, cut your deficit, get rid of those debts in those big investment banks, restructure that system, how the US would have responded. But I'm quite sure it wouldn't have been a yes, I'll do it.
I'm sure you're right. No large sovereign state would be likely to act on the IMF advice. Partly that's because the power flows the other way. The IMF doesn't hold any serious leverage over large sovereign states, only small dependent states. And the looming problems in the US system were being clearly labelled, identified and warned of within the US, but that didn't change US behaviour, so why would the IMF voice make any difference? If I can just add a second thought on that. The way the IMF is structured, and this is one of the reasons it needs urgently to be reformed, is that in the Bretton Woods agreement, the IMF was structured to give the US power of veto. It's the last country that the IMF will ever offer frank and fearless advice to.
I want to get to the US in a minute. Robert?
But is it really only the large countries? Small countries that are not in trouble don't have to listen to the IMF either. The point is that we have set up, I think we set up international organizations designed to fail. Basically, we tell the IMF, listen, you guys are responsible. If there's a crisis, go in there and solve it, and don't cause a lot of pain. but we don't give it the adequate regulatory power and authority prior to the crisis. So it's responsible for the rescue, but it doesn't have any power beforehand. And so that's why I think it's fundamentally weak and set up to fail. By the way, this is a characteristic of many global institutions.
But isn't this the fundamental tug of war, which is applicable to many institutions? But Tim Harcourt, fundamental tug of war, global economic frameworks, global financial systems, and nationalism, sovereignty.
Well, Alex, it's a really good point, and I think Bob touched on this. When you have a successful negotiation, it's simply about information and power. Information and power, or confidence, if you like. I used to work for Bill Kelty, and he said to me, in negotiations, you've got to have good information and you've got to have power. That's what makes you a good negotiator. He took me to an all-workers negotiation. The whole country was out on strike, and he came in and he said, give us the money or we'll stuff you. And I said, is that information or is that common? But I think it relates to Bob's point that you look at the Asian financial crisis and the AFC and the global financial crisis, the GFC, the Reserve Bank of Australia had very good information on Indonesia. Stephen Granville, then the Deputy Governor, had been an ambassador in Indonesia. Glenn Stevens knew the region well. And they stood up to the IMF. And I think Bob's right. The IMF acted like airport economists of the worst kind in the way they travelled around the region. And they made mistakes that they probably caused them to be a little bit more cautious this time. And I think, secondly, I think Peter Hartcher's point's important. When you think about how do you manufacture a federation or international financial architecture? I mean, do you get McKinsey to do a report on international financial architecture? I don't think you do. It basically does evolve, and you learn from crises such as the Asian financial crisis, and you adjust. It's a bit like Singapore. Singapore's very good at planning. They're very good at producing lots of engineers but not many ballet dancers. When they said to Singapore, you should be more creative, they said, well, we'll be creative between 10 and 12 on Saturday. And everyone has to do it. And I think there's the same thing with international financial architecture. There's an element of structure, there's an element of planning, but there also is an element of learning.
But also, I guess, if they have learnt and if behaviour has changed, there's also the very fundamental question of legitimacy. And I know that I've sat in the makeup room where one spends an enormous amount of time when you're over 40 and you work in television. And I've spoken to a very senior federal politician who will remain nameless. And we talked about at this time the IMF was constantly revising its world economic growth forecasts, including for Australia. I think there was one every month for 6 months. And I was asking this politician about that, and he was incredibly dismissive. He simply said, never worry about the IMF. They always get it wrong. I mean, does the IMF have, I guess, the credibility and legitimacy to build a future role?
I think that's the crucial point. So we set it up, we tell it to go in and solve the crisis, and we don't give it the adequate means. That would be my first point. My second point would be, if we gave it the means, real power, we would question its legitimacy. Because inherently, global institutions are vulnerable to challenges on the grounds of their legitimacy. The more we ask them to do, the more likely they are to be people who say, and who gave those bureaucrats the right to tell us what to do? So the truth is, we're very wedded to our nation states. And we have standards of legitimacy that are based on how we get legitimacy within a nation state. We have elections, we have open press, we do all kinds of things to allow our governments to be legitimate at the national level. But at the international level, how many people in this room are prepared to vote for a federation of the world, of the world, basically? Look at how unenthusiastic the Europeans are. We saw last week when it comes to voting for Europe. So I think this is the inherent tension with international institutions. And what I draw from that is that it is very important that we not ask them to do too much. They should only be asked to do the things for which we are prepared to properly equip them, and hence recognize that they are legitimate in order to do that. Those would be my principles for designing international organizations.
Well, the obviously next question is, what is not too much?
Well, in a sense, that's a very open question, because it does require a consensus among those who have, among the nation states, in terms of what they feel is inherently in their interest. If there are a significant group of countries who don't believe something is in their interest, the global institutions will be incapable, actually, of delivering on those questions. So we can sit here and talk about the architecture, but at the heart of the matter is politics, and national politics. And international organizations that work well will be ones which reflect national interests.
Well, then perhaps this is a good point just to take the conversation back a bit, and then we'll come back to this issue of what can be done and what's not too much. But let's look at who sits around that table, because if it's all about legitimacy, then the membership is so important. And as we've discussed, I mean, I think even after the most recent changes to the various quota systems, Brazil is going to have less weight than Belgium, which would seem rather bizarre. Peter Hartcher, can you see the rich countries really being prepared to wind back and to allow the emerging nations really big grown-up seats at the table?
We have beyond, we don't need to speculate, because we have, I think, a concrete real-world example of a very similar set of tensions. And that's in the current round of negotiations in the World Trade Organization, which have been running for, 7 years now. The so-called development round, the Doha round. It was called the development round because it was supposed to address the concerns of the developing countries. Before the crisis, it was unable to conclude a round. During the crisis, it was unable to conclude a round. And if you consider that we may, I guess you could either classify the current moment as in the middle of the crisis or just after the worst of the crisis. The WTO is still unable to conclude a round that would address the primary concerns of the developing countries. This is an example that would give us very little optimism that the IMF can adequately factor in the developing countries' concerns. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's just a precedent which I don't think gives us a lot of hope. Can I also pick up from the previous conversation on one of Bob's lines that we design international organisations to fail, in which case, Bob, we've designed the IMF very well. Not only has it failed in the tasks that it was not specifically designed to do, but Bob, your point that we should only expect them to succeed on areas that are squarely in their charter and where they're resourced, where they have the resources to act. The Asian crisis, Asian economic crisis, I think, was a case where it was squarely within the IMF charter. The IMF had the resources to address the problem, and yet the IMF still failed. And I think it failed, and I think we can also see that, at least to some extent, the current crisis is a result of the IMF failures in the last crisis, in the Asia crisis. And you touched on this already, Tim. But if you can just indulge me for 1 minute while I just retrace some of the subterranean history of that event. When the Indonesian government ran into a capital account crisis, the IMF turned up and gave them a solution designed for a current account crisis, a different kind of crisis. It was inappropriate. It inflicted unnecessary suffering on tens of millions of Indonesians. The officials who were involved in the negotiations and in the IMF program say that the chief source, the chief impulse for the advice and the template that the IMF used was the US Treasury, and in particular in the person of Tim Geithner, who has since, as we all know, become US Treasury Secretary.
That's Paul Keating, isn't it, speaking there?
It's Paul Keating, but it's also central bank and Treasury officials who were involved in the room in discussions at the time. But Paul Keating has, on the record, made that argument. Now, so in this chain of events, you have a US Treasury official prescribing a wrong solution for an Indonesian crisis. The IMF embraces that solution, imposes it on Indonesia. Now, that's interesting enough if that's where the story ends, but the story doesn't end there. Because guess what? Other countries are watching. Other countries, including a country called China, one of the conclusions that China draws from this experience is we must never allow ourselves to be in a position where we are dependent on the IMF, because look what happens. You then have China hoarding its treasure, and people then complaining that China, by hoarding its treasure, is contributing to these big global macro imbalances, which then in turn contributes to the current crisis. So not only has the IMF, I think you're right, Bob, we designed it to fail and very successfully designed it, because not only has it failed where it's not been supposed to act, even in charter areas where it's been properly resourced, there have been failures which have now fed through into the big macro developments in the world and helped set up the conditions for later crises.
But Peter, you don't believe that they've changed, as Robert has argued?
I don't believe what, sir?
That they have changed, that they've done a mea culpa, if you look at their current behaviour, as Robert argued initially?
They have done a mea culpa about the handling of the previous crisis, yes.
No, but look at the actual programs that are currently in place for many African countries, where conditionality has been reduced, where a lot of attention has been paid to the social consequences of the policies. I think there are radical changes in their behavior as a result of what they've learned from the Asian financial crisis. I want to return to your observations about the World Trade Organization. I think let's distinguish firstly between the question of representation on the one hand and the question of efficacy on the other. And I think there is to some degree a trade-off between achieving each of those two objectives. When it comes to representation, in fact, I think the WTO is a model, because what we've seen, unlike the Uruguay round, where in effect the United States and the European Union dictated the terms, decided on the agreement, when France and the US could agree on agricultural policy, we got the Uruguay round. That was your father's Oldsmobile, as they say in the commercial. But if we look at what happened at Cancun, for instance, when the G20 were able to organize and cause the whole negotiation to fail, the G20, whose key members are all developing countries, what we see in the WTO, because the WTO decision-making process is by consensus, what we're seeing is the emergence of very strong poles of tension, but nonetheless of power, in the hands of developing countries. So the talks broke down last July, because China and India were on one side and the US was on the other.
Now, that's fundamentally different to the IMF.
So I do see, yes, exactly. So the WTO is in a sense a leading indicator, because the WTO decisions, I think, are legitimate. Because they are decisions that are being taken now by consensus, where enough of the developing countries have the ability to say no. So we've got that side of it taken care of. But I think coming out of that is also an indication of how much more difficult it is now to reach agreement. Once we provide for more people into the room, and once power is more multipolar, it's more problematic to actually come up with very decisive decisions, because fundamentally we have nation states with different interests.
I know from a personal point of view, I was the ABC's Beijing correspondent when there were all those negotiations for China to enter the WTO. I cannot tell you how many hours we spent outside in the snow waiting year after year, but eventually they got there. Tim Harcourt, can you see a time where there will be a shift? Because until that shift in the balance of power within the IMF happens, half the world's not going to give it legitimacy.
Well, I mean, there's three issues here. I think on the trade side, the WTO, it's not as dead as a Doha yet. I think it's struggling, but there's still a chance because of the need for it. I think firstly there's this membership issue, as Bob says. I mean, Bretton Woods said the head of the World Bank's an American or an Australian who takes out American citizenship. The head of the IMF is a European. That's obviously got to change, and the WTO in a way has been, as Bob said, a leading indicator for that. But as Peter points out, with trade negotiations, they are a marathon, not a sprint. With the IMF, it's like the fire brigade. You've got to get there quickly. And so the purposes are quite different. And I think in many ways, when we had the battle for Seattle 10 years ago, before the 2000 election, where it was almost the high watermark of the anti-globalisation movement, they targeted the WTO even though we know that trade for the most part is better for improving wages and reducing poverty. But perhaps the issues were more towards capital and financial markets. And I think a good case can be made in the current global financial crisis in terms of the institutions of international trade are okay. They could be quicker, but they're okay. But how we allocate capital and how we regulate capital flows across borders, we're not so sure of the answer. And even Alan Greenspan, I mean, I think he's going to rewrite his latest memoirs as "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles," because he's actually said himself, look, I probably, in terms of my ideology and my philosophy, went too far. And he's probably the only official that's done that.
Well, what about, and this is one proposal that I read in my much trawling of the internet, the proposal of a World Finance Organisation along the lines of a WTO. So when you look at trying to get some sort of global regulatory system, the WFO would define obligations and then have an independent panel of experts who could work out compliance. Tim, do you think that would work?
I think there'd be fine principles involved, but I think it would come back to Peter's point, is, why would China let the IMF or the WFO take charge? It was hard enough convincing China itself for WTO membership, let alone the rest of the world, and we forget how many laws China had to change. I mean, even its labour market, before if you came from Chengdu, you couldn't work in Beijing or Shanghai. They had to change their entire labour market system to join the WTO. So I think there'd be a question of to what extent China and India would want to be part of that.
The question is sort of, do you want your regulators to be in the same institution as the people who give out the money? And my preference would be to keep them separate, because you really want your regulators to have independence. And frequently when it comes to giving out money, the people who are giving it out tend to have a bigger say.
Yes, but the IMF has that very strong surveillance role. Doesn't the surveillance really belong with the regulator?
Well, it depends what we mean by the regulation. Surveilling macroeconomic policy, yes. Detailed surveillance of financial institutions, in my view, probably no. So, but it is a question of kind of how you put those things together.
So what do you think is achievable? I mean, if we talk about, is it baby steps, and is it just simply getting a set of norms within the IMF? What can be done?
Well, I think the key issue is if the IMF actually proves itself by its actions in this crisis to be more friendly to countries who get into trouble through no fault of their own, then other countries will conclude that they can actually rely on the IMF and therefore not have to take care of everything themselves. I agree with what was said earlier, that the lessons that countries drew from the Asian financial crisis is you can't afford to rely on the IMF. That's big trouble. So the way you avoid it is you keep your exchange rate very weak and you accumulate financial reserves as much as you can to take care of yourself. And so basically that was the lasting failure of the IMF. So if you want to reverse that process, it has to be an IMF that is adequately endowed and that can therefore be something countries can rely on if they should be hit by shocks. By the way, when it comes to, it also has to be legitimate. And in that sense, it's obvious what has to happen. There are three questions. There's shares, there's chairs, and there's the head. Those are the three things. The problem is that Europe is too large in terms of its quotas relative to its economic weight. A lot of those powers who sit around should be obviously consolidated into the European Union, and it can sit at the table as one representative. And that's going to clean up the IMF so that the board is much smaller than it currently is. So that's sort of that's the chairs. And then the shares, obviously, developing countries need more representation. And it's an outrage that the head should either be an American or a European. And the head should be chosen in the same way as we choose the head, say, of the World Trade Organization. So those are the three elements. And the key losers in this equation are actually the Europeans. And so they're the ones who have to be dragged kicking and screaming to acknowledge, the reality that they need to make way.
Well, that brings us back to Doha, doesn't it? I mean, if you look at how far we've got